I was born in 1955, 10 years after the war ended. And I'll tell you something. When you grow up in that era, Germany is not a neutral word. It carries weight. It carries ash. The adults around you don't talk about it the way you read about it in books. They go quiet, or they go cold. I grew up in the shadow of a war I didn't fight. And then I spent 30 years in uniform, in a world still being shaped by that war's aftermath. I was stationed in West Germany in the late 70s. I remember standing near the border, looking east across that line, thinking, this is what defeat looks like when it gets frozen in time. One side rebuilt, one side didn't. Same people, same language, same rubble to start from. Two completely different outcomes. And I've spent the better part of my life trying to understand why. So if you've got 15 minutes, sit with me. Because the story of how Germany came back from absolute nothing is one of the most important stories nobody tells properly. What does a country look like when it hits absolute bottom? May 8th, 1945. Germany surrenders unconditionally. Now I want you to understand what that means on the ground. Not in textbooks, but in actual human terms. 60% of housing is destroyed or damaged. 17 million people are displaced, just wandering. The currency is worthless. People are trading cigarettes for bread. The country is split in four, occupied by foreign armies who can barely agree on anything. There is no government, no army, no sovereignty. The nation that started the deadliest war in human history has been reduced to rubble and silence. When I was stationed there in '78, parts of Frankfurt still had buildings with shrapnel scars on the walls. 30 years later, still there. You don't really understand what total defeat means until you've put your hand on one of those walls. This wasn't a setback. This was a country that ceased to exist. The question I kept asking myself, even then as a young soldier, wasn't how they recovered. It was, why didn't they just stay broken? When your former enemy decides to rebuild you, here's the part where people want to say America was generous, and in a way, it was. But let me be honest with you the way my old commanding officer used to be honest with me. Nobody does something for nothing in geopolitics. It's 1947. The Soviets are expanding westward. Half of Europe is exhausted, hungry, and looking for something to believe in. A broken Germany, sitting in the center of a broken continent, is a recruitment poster for communism. So Secretary of State George Marshall gets up at Harvard and proposes something unprecedented, rebuilding the countries you just finished fighting. About $13 billion. That's somewhere north of $150 billion in today's money. West Germany receives around $1.4 billion of it. I grew up during the Cold War. I understand the calculation. It wasn't charity, it was strategy. But here's what I learned in 30 years of service. Even when the right thing is done for complicated reasons, it can still be the right thing. The Marshall Plan gave West Germany oxygen. What the Germans did with that oxygen, that's the real story. One man, one decision. One weekend, June 20th, 1948. A man named Ludwig Erhard, the director of economics for the Western Occupation Zone, does something that nobody authorized him to do. He scraps the old currency over a weekend, introduces the Deutsche Mark, abolishes price controls without asking permission from the Allied commanders. When the American general finds out, he calls Ehrhart and tells him his advisors say it's a catastrophic mistake. Ehrhart says, "Mine say the same thing," and he did it anyway. I respect that more than I probably should. In the military, you learn to follow orders. You also learn slowly, if you're lucky, when following orders isn't the same as doing the right thing. Ehrhart made a call, a unilateral, unauthorized, potentially career-ending call, and within weeks, shelves that had been empty for 3 years started filling up, because people trusted the new money, and when people trust money, they stop hoarding and start trading. Between 1950 and 1963, West Germany's economy grew at roughly 8% per year. 8%, sustained, for over a decade. I've sat in enough budget briefings and strategy sessions to tell you that kind of number doesn't come from luck. It comes from a decision made at exactly the right moment by someone willing to be wrong in front of everyone. I want to talk about something that doesn't get enough credit. In the 70s, when I was coming up, America had serious labor unrest, strikes, factory shutdowns, management and workers treating each other like enemies. I watched it affect military supply chains. I watched it affect morale. West Germany, meanwhile, was doing something different. They built a system called Mitbestimmung, co-determination. Workers sat on corporate boards, unions had real power, but in exchange, both sides committed to stability. No wildcat strikes, no scorched earth tactics. Management didn't treat workers as costs to be cut. Workers didn't treat companies as targets to be bled. They built together. Now, I'm not naive. It wasn't perfect. There were tensions, disputes, difficult years. But the fundamental framework held, and I've thought about that a lot since I retired. The countries I've seen fall apart. They almost always fall apart the same way. Not because they lacked resources, not because they lacked talent, but because the people inside couldn't agree on enough to build anything that lasted. Germany agreed on enough. That's rarer than it sounds. What it looks like when a nation actually reckons with what it did. I have to talk about this one carefully, because it matters. I served alongside German officers in NATO exercises throughout the 80s, good men, professional, serious about their work. And I noticed something about them that took me years to fully understand. They carried something. Not guilt exactly. Most of them were born decades after the war. But an awareness, a weight that their country had placed on their shoulders deliberately, because Germany had decided, as a matter of national policy, that forgetting was not an option. West Germany paid reparations to Israel and to Jewish survivors. They built the Holocaust Memorial in the heart of Berlin. They criminalized denial. They rewrote their schools to make sure every generation understood not just what happened, but how it happened. How ordinary institutions and ordinary people can be turned toward extraordinary evil. I grew up during the Cold War, when the line between us and them felt very clear. I'm 70 years old now, and that line looks a lot more complicated than it did. What Germany did, looking directly at the worst of itself without flinching for decades, that is not a small thing. I believe it's part of why the world was willing to trust them again. and I believe it's part of why they were willing to trust themselves. The numbers and what I saw with my own eyes. Let me give you some numbers, and then I'll tell you what I actually saw. In 1950, West Germany's standard of living was comparable to countries in Latin America. By 1970, 20 years, it was among the highest in the world. By the time I was stationed there in the late 70s, West Germany didn't look like a defeated country. It looked like the future: clean streets, rebuilt cathedrals, engineering that made your jaw drop. Volkswagen, Mercedes, Siemens, Bayer, companies that had been bombed flat, were now setting global standards. By the 1980s, West Germany was the world's largest exporter, not America, not Japan, Germany. And then, November 9th, 1989. I was in my mid-30s. I remember watching it on television, the wall coming down, people on top of it with hammers, crying, laughing, East Germans crossing into the West for the first time in their lives. I had stood at that border a decade earlier and thought it would be there forever. It wasn't. And reunification, absorbing 45 years of Soviet-style communism overnight, nearly broke the economy. It cost over $2 trillion. It took 15 painful years. But Germany did it. Today, largest economy in Europe, fourth in the world, founding member of the EU, cornerstone of NATO, from unconditional surrender to global superpower in less than 50 years. I'm 70 years old. I've watched empires stretch and contract. I've seen nations that looked unbreakable fall apart in a decade. And I've seen places I wrote off as hopeless find their footing in ways that still surprise me. Germany surprises me. Still. After all these years. Because the lesson isn't, here's how to get rich after losing a war. The lesson is about something older and harder than economics. It's about whether a people can be honest about who they are, the good and the terrible, and choose deliberately to build something better. Germany made that choice, not perfectly, not all at once, not without pain, but they made it. I think about that when I look at the world my grandchildren are going to inherit. The problems are different. The scale is different. But the fundamental question is the same one Germany faced in 1945. What do you do when everything you thought you were is gone? Do you rebuild on the same foundation? Or do you look at the rubble honestly and build something that actually lasts? Germany chose the second option. And that, more than any policy or any dollar amount, is why they're still standing. Take care of yourselves. I'll see you in the next one.